Hello and welcome to the 32nd Annual Midland Storytelling Festival, where you can enjoy more than 15 hours of storytelling from our professional artists. There are so many opportunities and ways to participate in this year's festival. All of our events are taking place at the beautiful Bush Convention Center in downtown Midland. The schedule of events can be found on our Midland Storytelling Festival Facebook page or our website at www.midlandstorytellingfestival.org. We're kicking off this festival weekend with a virtual introduction to our ensemble of master tellers. Throughout the weekend, you will hear stories from Antonio Hasha, Barbara McBride Smith, Bill Lepp, Willie Claflin, Laura Pershing Raynor, Donald Davis, and we're welcoming a new artist to our festival, Donna Washington. So, you know what to do. Settle in and let the stories begin.
This is Antonio Hasha with you, and do I have a story to share right now? It so happened long, long ago in a land far away from here. There once was a hunter, a newlywed hunter. Yes, the two of them, yes, husband and wife, set out to create a homestead like no other in a place so beautiful and filled with life. The sky was covered with animals that flew, the forest with animals that prowled about, and the rivers and streams filled with fish. It was gorgeous. It was beautiful. And they had all sorts of animals in their homestead. There were ducks and horses and beautiful dogs, mules, geese. Oh, they loved one another and worked hard. Their nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. At night, the sky would be filled with stars. And if you kept nice and quiet, you'd hear silence. Now, that's a special sound. Well, trapping season was coming. And the young man started to prepare his tools and for the expedition. He felt like it, especially in this place, because he was going to be gone for 2 weeks. And his wife was preparing him sweet breads and other treats to accompany him. She would be all by herself, and he would be all by himself. But not really, for no one could be by themselves in such a place. They hugged each other goodbye, and off he went. Trapping season, 2 weeks away from home. And he went off, setting traps this way, and setting traps that way, setting traps here and there, and everywhere throughout this gorgeous forest. And as he was approaching the end of the second week, already planning to start his walk home, Pah! He tripped on something, and he looked down to see if there was a rock or it was a root protruding from the ground, and he was going to deliver a slew of colorful words. But to his surprise, it was not a root, it was not a rock, but a stick. A strange looking stick. And he turned towards it, and it looked like there was a curve to it. There was only about 5 inches sticking out of the ground, but the top was kind of flat at an angle. It looked like it had been carved. So he got down on his knees and he started digging and digging and digging and digging around it. And sure enough, this had been carved, and it was ornate. It looked like a handle of some sort of a tool, but it was so firm there, he could not budge it. He had about 7 inches of it sticking out now, and he held onto it, and he was trying to soften the ground around it, but it would not move. It was really, really buried in there. Try to do this with me. Let's do a little bit of mime here together. Come on, this is fun. So you grab it like this. First you look at it. Then you grab that handle. And then the other hand, you put around this hand, the first hand. And then you move everything but the hands, okay? So you go this way, but this doesn't move. So you can't do that, because if you do this, it means it's loose. Okay, so it's not loose, it's stuck. So you're gonna move everything but your hands. So you're isolating the hands, and you can move your head really hard. You see, it looks really, it's not going anywhere, is it? And so he dug some more, and he's digging there. His nails are all dark with dirt, and he's just digging and digging and digging and digging and digging, and he's got a whole foot out. He's got a whole foot, and the thing is still stuck. Come on, let's do it again. And nothing. He would not budge. Thing was stuck. So he got his knife, and he's digging around with his knife, and now he has quite a bit of it sticking out, more than a foot. So he stands up and he grabs onto it with both hands. Yeah. And he's pulling this thing, he's grabbing in all sorts of manner, and he can't lift it. And then, with all his might, he takes a deep breath, and he pulls, and the thing flies out. It's unbelievable. It was an axe. It was a major axe. This thing was like Paul Bunyan grade kind of axe, you know. It was heavy. It was something that he looked at it on the ground there, and it was so big that he didn't even know that if he could, use it. Perhaps he was going to decorate it, put it on top of his mantle, and then the head of the axe was huge. This thing was major. It was covered in rust, but nothing that he could, brush it off and oil it. Ooh, there's a dent on the blade. Right there, there's a dent. But he could hammer it, heat it up, and hammer it, and smooth it out. It was okay to have a dent. He was going to get rid of it. What a major find. This axe was amazing. And he put it on over his shoulder, and he started his way home with his prize find. And he walked home. And his wife was waiting for him anxiously. 2 weeks. Had been 2 weeks. But no signs of him. No signs of him at all. 2.5 weeks. 3 weeks now, she was not sleeping anymore. She knew something was wrong. So she got on her horse and went to the homestead 10 miles away. Told them about it. And they created a search party. And they went on looking for him. And it was 4 weeks into the search that they came upon his body. I'm sorry to report, but he had died from a major accident.
Oh, man.
I'm no detective, so please don't ask me any questions. Come on, get a handle on it. Gotta be careful with those X with a dent. All right, I hope to see you live sooner than later. Bye.
Well, hello, hello. I know, there's an elephant in the room. But don't be distracted. He's perfectly happy with his boy and his book. Today I've got a story to tell you. It's a shocking story about something that happened to me. And here's what really happened. It was about 9 years ago. I was out in my front yard. I was digging in the flower beds. I was planting pansies. It's a ritual that I had been observing for about 45 years. I love pansies. I love the brightness of the colors, especially the yellow ones, the ones with the dark splotch in the middle that looks like a face smiling up at you. Pansies are wonderful for planting in the fall because they're resilient. They can survive through the harshest winters. But there's one thing about pansies that has always disappointed me. There's no smell. For me, anyway. I mean, I don't expect them to smell like honeysuckle or roses, but at least they could smell like something. Well, I stuck my shovel into the dirt to dig that last hole to plant the last pansy in my tray, and whoosh, my world went dark. I woke up sometime later. I'm not sure how long it was, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I was surrounded by about 3 emergency medical technicians, by several neighbors. My husband was sitting on the ground next to me, patting my hand, telling me that every little thing was going to be okay. I had several medical instruments attached to my body. Finally, I was able to catch my breath. I looked up at everybody and I said, "What in the world are y'all looking at?" Well, finally, I sat up and I was told what happened. My shovel had struck an electrical line buried under the dirt. It led to that fancy decorative landscape lighting fixture we had over next to the flower bed. I always thought it was solar. Turns out it wasn't. It was electric. And then I took a deep breath and I realized something. For the first time in my life, I could smell pansies. And I knew that somebody had been watching over me and that I had received a gift that day. I decided not to put that last pansy into that hole with the electrical wire at the bottom of it. I put that pansy in a small pot and I put it right next to my back door. And every morning that fall and that winter, I would walk out there with my cup of coffee in my hand, and I would look down at that little pansy smiling up at me, and I would feel grateful. My love for pansies actually began in 1966, the year that I got married. My husband and I lived in a tiny apartment. It was sort of a one-room-fits-all kind of a place. Now, today, realtors would probably call it a tiny house. It was a tiny house, but it was also just a tool shed that had been upgraded with a toilet being tacked onto the back of it. It was for graduate students at the college who desperately needed housing near campus. Well, it was a drab little apartment, ugly to be honest. So I decided that fall, that first year we lived there, that I would plant flowers somewhere out in front of the house to cheer things up. I didn't know what could survive through the fall on into the winter. This was West Texas, and there would be a lot of dust, there would be a lot of wind, and there would be occasional snow and maybe some ice in the winter. And our apartment sat on an alley, so we were surrounded by gravel. Well, that Thanksgiving, we went home to visit family, and I asked my mom, what kind of flowers could I plant that would make it through the winter? And she said, well, the only thing she planted in the fall to make it through the winter were greens. Collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens. Well, I love me some greens, but I don't think they qualify as flowers. So I asked my sister Pat what she planted in her garden for the fall and winter, and she drove me over to her house and she showed me her flower beds were full of pansies. She told me how much she loved them, all the colors, but especially the bright yellow ones with the dark splotch that looked like a face smiling up at you. And best of all, she told me, was the smell. She said, you can plant the pansies with garlic. The smell of the pansies is always better than the smell of the garlic. Well, I leaned over. I sniffed at her flower beds. I could smell the garlic she had planted. I couldn't smell the pansies. But when I got back to our little apartment on the alley, I planted pansies. Now, like I said, we didn't really have dirt. We just had gravel. So my husband found a big wine barrel. Where he got it, I don't know, but we dragged it up onto the tiny porch in front of the little house. We filled it with dirt, and then I planted pansies. And in the very middle, a couple of garlic cloves. I could smell the garlic. I couldn't smell the pansies. Every year after that, no matter where we lived, I always planted pansies in October. 10 years ago, my sister Pat died. The cancer took her quickly. She didn't even have time to plant her pansies and her garlic that fall. And so in November, on what would have been her 76th birthday, her daughter, my niece, and I, we planted pansies in my sister's yard. I said to my niece, you know, your mom loved pansies. She loved that they were bright. She loved that they could survive through the harshest winter. But best of all, she loved the smell. I love pansies because your mom loved them. And I loved her. But I've never been able to smell them the way she could. my niece smiled at me and she said, "You know, I think maybe someday Mom will pass that gift on to you." And that's exactly what happened. 1 year later, I had my shocking experience with electricity while I was planting pansies. And when I realized that I could finally smell them, I knew I had been given a gift. My sister had been with me that day. Well, this very morning, I walked outside to my back deck and I looked at a big whiskey barrel I have. I had planted it full of pansies last month in October. Now, I don't worry about what my neighbors think about me having a whiskey barrel on my back deck. I figure I'm old enough it's none of my business anymore what my neighbors think of me. But I love going out there with my cup of coffee every morning. I smile when I see those pansies smiling back at me. And I give thanks for the memories that the pansies have brought me, for the resilience that they have taught me, and thanks for another good day on this wonderful planet Earth.
It was 2 in the morning before buck season. I was sitting in my living room watching a movie, waiting for the sun to come up so I could go deer hunting, when I heard a knock on the back door. Well, I knew not to answer it, because I knew if anybody was knocking on my back door at 2 in the morning the day of buck season, it had to be Skeeter. And if Skeeter was knocking on my back door, he had come up with one of his plans, and I didn't want to go along with it. But there was no free will involved. I was sucked up off the couch and drawn to the back door. And when I opened the door, there stood Skeeter, with a diabolical grin on his face and a paper bag in his hand. And I got a sick feeling way down in my stomach. But I invited him in anyway. He didn't say nothing. It was like letting a vampire into my house. And Skeeter went, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he put that paper bag on the floor. And I went to brew up a pot of coffee, because I could tell it was going to be a long night. And after a while, I brought the coffee over, and finally, Skeeter said to me, he said, "I've been up all night sewing." And he reached down, and he opened up that paper bag. And he reached in, and he pulled out something long and brown and furry. And he sort of flipped it open and pulled it on his head. And by gosh, that kid could sew. What he had made was a perfect replica of an 8-point buck's head. And he said to me from inside that deer mask, he said, "Don't worry, I made one for you too." So there we were, 2 young bucks drinking coffee at the kitchen table. I know, it is a terrible joke, but if you'd have thought of it, you'd have put it in your story. But I knew that couldn't be the whole plan. And after a minute, Skeeter said, "That ain't the whole plan." He said, "I also took a mannequin. I dressed him in hunter's orange, and I tied him to the hood of my truck." He said, "What we are going to do, not do you want to. He said, what we are going to do is drive around town like it's people season. And we got one. He said, we'll drive up to the check-in station, we'll check our human, everybody will think it's funny. Well, it was funny, but it's precisely the sort of funny that you don't want your dad to find out that it was you who did it. So we decided to go hide out. We had about 6 hours to kill before dawn. So we went up the old service road at the state park. We were sitting up there in Skeeter's truck, just waiting for the sun to rise. Now, Skeeter had just got his truck brand new that summer, only had about 80,000 miles on the odometer. But the odometer was in the glove box. It was mechanically disassociated from every other part of the vehicle. And the first time I'd ever gone to roll down the passenger side window, I took about a quarter turn on the crank, and the window just went thunk, and we never saw it again. which was fine in the summer because the truck didn't have air conditioning. But that night, it was about 20 degrees outside, and the wind was blowing right in that open window. There was frost building up on both sides of the windshield. We didn't have enough money to buy enough gasoline to run the engine, to run the heater for 6 hours. I don't know if I've made this clear, but Skeeter and I were pretty dumb. So we weren't dressed properly. Finally, I reached in that bag, pulled out one of those masks, and put it on. Well, it was warm and cozy inside that mask. Skeeter reached in that bag, pulled out his mask, and put his on. Pretty soon, we fell asleep. Well, when I fell asleep, my head fell right out that open window. And you know how sometimes when you're sleeping, your subconscious will pick up on something and be like, wake up, get up, do something. But other times, maybe like a snake crawled into your bed, your subconscious will just sort of whisper, now, open your eyes, but don't move. Well, that's what my subconscious was telling me. So I just sort of opened my eyes. And sure enough, about 30 yards down the road, there were two bright lights, about 4 or 5 feet apart. They were maybe 3 feet off the ground. And the sun was just starting to turn the sky gray. I could barely make out the silhouette of a large American sedan. And as the sun came up over the mountaintop, 2 sunbeams came down the mountain, up that dirt road, over the back of that car, and across the top of that car. And one of those sunbeams went through a blue light, and one of those sunbeams went through a red light. The door of that car opened up. Sheriff Hasbro started to get out. Now, Sheriff Hasbro was a big man. He was about 6'8", 6'9", weighed about 480 pounds. But it wasn't all muscle, so it took him a long time to get out of a Ford Tempo. And as Sheriff Hasbro was getting out of that car, I was poking Skeeter, trying to wake him up. And pretty soon, Sheriff Hasbro was creeping up the road. He had that big flashlight on his shoulder. He was coming in slow. Y'all know that saying, discretion is the better part of valor? Well, Sheriff Hasbro was real into that better part of valor. But I don't want to call the man a coward, because after all, you don't want to just run up on a pickup truck with a guy tied to the hood and 2 deer in the cab. And I was laying there thinking, the smartest thing to do is to do nothing. But the smartest thing isn't really my strong suit. And then I started thinking, how many times in your life do you have the opportunity to scare the pants off the duly elected officials of your county? I mean, if you were ever a teenager in a small town, you know that the police don't always have enough to do. So they come looking for you to see what you're doing. And Skeeter and I were conscientious young men who endeavored to participate in activities which allowed local law enforcement to practice the skills that they had learned at the academy. So I thought, I'm just going to make a little deer noise. And I sort of went, huh, like that. Now, I'm not saying it was a good deer noise, but it was effective. Sheriff Hasbro, all 6'8", 480 pounds of him, he just left the ground. He jumped so high that Skeeter had time to start the engine, defrost the windshield, and drive underneath of him before he ever came back down. We just made our way around that sheriff's cruiser headed on into town. Now, we were 16 years old. We weren't lawyers. We hadn't been to law school. But we had watched a lot of Starsky and Hutch. And he had never said freeze. He hadn't read us our rights. He hadn't told us we were under arrest. How were we supposed to know we were in trouble? Who knew that it was illegal to impersonate a deer? Skeeter and I just headed on into town. Now, the road in the $50 is pretty straight by West Virginia standards, but it is one of these up and down jobs. And after a little while, we could see that sheriff's car coming up over the hills behind us. Now, he still wasn't gaining on us. I wanted to find out what was going on, so I switched on the CB, turned it to the police channel, just in time to hear Sheriff Hasbro say, Tom was the deputy. He said, Tom, I don't care if you think I am crazy. There are 2 deer driving Skeeter Bart's pickup truck down the highway. And I believe they got Skeeter tied to the hood. And Tom said, well, good. Well, you can see how that might hurt our feelings. I switched off the CB, we headed on into town. But this was 1986. This was a long time ago. This was before CNN, certainly before the internet. We didn't even get public radio back there in half dollar. So what people did for their news and information in the morning was turn on their police scanners. So when we came around the corner into Main Street, there were people lined up and down both sides of the street drinking coffee with their curlers in. I thought H.G. Wells was landing spaceships on the courthouse lawn. I wanted to find out what was going on, so I switched the CB back on, just in time to hear Tom say, "Sheriff Hasbro, I called the FBI, just like you said. And the FBI said you should consider them two deer armed and dangerous. They said you're allowed to use lethal force if necessary." Well, that was a little bit more than me and Skeeter had bargained for, so Skeeter just pulled the truck to the side of the road, and Sheriff Hasbro pulled in behind us, and after a minute he got out of his car and came over and yelled at us for a good long time, made us take off our masks, and gave us each a ticket for the crime of mayhem, dressed as an 8-point buck. We each had to pay a little fine and do a little community service. But I think what we learned from all of this is they say that true forgiveness only comes after you've honestly repented of your sins, after you promise to never do the same thing again, and after you swear to never take any glory from the original action. So I think I can safely say, with that in mind, that Skeeter and I will never be forgiven for what we did that day.
About 5 years ago, my wife was doing the taxes. She said, "Hey, Willie, you know what?" I said, "What?" She said, "We work for a stuffed moose." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you do a lot of stuff, a lot of kinds of concerts and teaching and stuff, but 2/3 of all of our income comes from stuff that has to do with Maynard moose." Now, if you've been to the Midland Festival before, you will know my dear friend Maynard Moose, who always comes with me. In fact, like a lot of other festivals, I have a suspicion that Maynard gets invited to Midland and I'm allowed to tag along. Because when I get invited to a festival, people will say, "Hey, Willie, do you want to come to the festival?" And I'll say, "Sure." And there's a little pause, and then they'll say, "You will bring the moose, won't you?" And my guess is they probably would hire the moose all by himself, except that he's not ambulatory. He doesn't have any vocal cords. So I have to tag along. It's okay. I don't mind. I don't mind that 2/3 of our income comes from a stuffed moose. And my wife said, "Exactly how did that happen? How did it happen?" It's something storyteller Bill Harley wonders too. A couple years ago, I was on the road. We like to complain to each other. I was complaining. I was whining. I'd been on the road a long time, did a lot of schools. And I said, "I'm tired." And he said, "Willie, get a grip. You wave a stuffed moose around to make a living. Get a grip." I thought, "Oh, right. Yeah." So when my wife wanted to know how it happened, I said, "Okay, that's easy. What happened was, well, when I was 5, I had dozens of stuffed animals, buried under stuffed animals. They were all over my bed. They fell on the floor. They were under the bed. They blocked the doorway. And one day, I couldn't get to sleep. I think I needed a drink of water. My folks were having a party downstairs. And so I came down the stairs halfway. I was about 5 years old. And I said, "Mommy, can I have a glass of water?" And she said, "Oh, sure, dear." And one of the guests who knew me was very kind, said, "Hello, Billy. Hey, Billy, I've been meaning to ask you, what do you think you'll do for a living when you grow up?" And I said, "I'm going to play with my stuffed animals." And everybody at the party laughed. I was embarrassed. I remembered it because I was very embarrassed. I didn't know quite what do for a living meant, and I couldn't really imagine doing whatever it was they did because they didn't have any stuffed animals. And what kind of life is that? Well, anyway, if you fast forward until I'm 17, there I am at the all-boys boarding school, the Phillips Exeter Academy. I was shipped off to boarding school at age 13, coat, tie, proper posture. Yes, sir, no radios, study 24 hours a day, must go to Harvard, because that was my father's plan for me. I would go to a preparatory academy for boys. I would get serious. I would go to Harvard and I would become a lawyer. He had it all planned out. This was a long time ago. Often dads planned out what their sons would do, and the sons just did what the dad had planned. But about 2 months before graduation, I remember standing in my room and all of a sudden going, bing, wow, how'd I get here? Ooh, what's this? What is this? I became sort of conscious. And I thought, oh, I don't have to go to Harvard and become a lawyer. I could do almost anything. About that time, we had to pick our profession for the senior yearbook. This was an important thing. Pick some significant profession that you think will have a positive contribution to society. So all my classmates had put in, doctor, lawyer, molecular biologist, State Department, whatever. I put in serendipitist because I knew all about the three princes of serendip and how just by keeping their minds and their eyes open, they were beneficiaries of incredible lucky accidents and they lived happily forever after. I thought it's serendipity. That's what you should have as a profession. And I said, I'm going to be a serendipitist. And my advisor said, I don't need to hear some puerile jokes. I need a significant profession here. And I said, but it's my profession and I'm going to be a serendipitist. He said, well, clearly there's no such thing. I guess you plan on making a joke out of this. Do you joke out of everything? I said, well, if I can. Very well, he said. It's a bad choice. You'll have to live with it. But it was then that I decided to become a full-time professional serendipitist at age 17. And that is what I have been ever since. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're always seeking your fortune. Or as they used to say back in the 80s, you proceed as the way opens. Anyway, I went to Harvard. I did not become a lawyer. Something went wrong. Music was what went wrong. Folk music came along, just like Pete Seeger. I graduated from Harvard, but then I decided I was going to make a living as a folk singer, and then I'd also teach little kids because I was fascinated how little kids learn. I told my father, he said, really? You're going to teach little kids and play folk music? Oh, well. My mother she said, whatever makes you happy. So there I was, my first job out of college, and I taught Head Start. Head Start program in the projects not far from Harvard. And I would say good morning to all the boys and girls when they came in and individually, and I'd say goodbye when they left. And there was one little girl that never said a word and never looked at anybody. She just never said a word. She participated in stuff, but she never looked at anybody. And it was very strange. She didn't talk. And I don't know why, but about halfway between the beginning and the end of the year, midwinter sometime, she came to school and instead of just saying good morning, I said, hi there, good morning, with my hand. And she shot her hand up and she said, good morning. And my hand said, what you gonna do today? And her hand said, I don't know. What are you gonna do? And my hand said, I don't know. I thought, wow, what's that? What's that? What just happened? Some kind of little miracle just happened. Some kind of miracle of communication, some kind of loop. Because we weren't us. We were somebody else. I thought, that's amazing. Puppets are incredible because you can become somebody else. And then if you're shy or embarrassed or whatever, you have the puppet. You don't have to worry about it. It doesn't have to be you. You can communicate directly. And so when I was given Maynard Moose about that same time, I would take him into school especially when I started teaching older kids. I mean, by older, I mean K1, 2s. I'd bring the Moose into school, Maynard Moose, got him at a craft fair, given to me, lovely, hand fit perfectly, and he was confused about things, and that was fine. The kindergartners and the first graders just loved that. The little boy blue, come blow your nose, the sheep in the meadow, the cow eat my clothes. They loved it. What he was really good at, though, was teaching reading. Because the kids were very reluctant to learn to read. It was a chore. I mean, for the ones that had a hard time, it was a chore. And they didn't want to have to sit down one-on-one, sit next to the large man and be forced to read. But I brought Maynard in, and Maynard really couldn't read. He couldn't make any combined sounds. She was sahi, and the was tahi. And a name like Stephen was step hen. And all of a sudden, the kids loved reading. They loved teaching the moose how to read. And their reading scores went way up. And I thought, there it is again. That's that thing about the hand. Something else is going on. This magic thing, this moose, this hand is communicating somehow. Well, it went on like that. About once a month, I'd do a school assembly. It was a small private school, 250 kids about. And I'd always include the moose along with the sing-alongs and stuff. And then when I left teaching in '84, Maynard came with me to do school programs. And I realized very quickly that Maynard would actually happily just take over the whole time. That the kids would love to hear Maynard, and they liked the songs and they liked my stories, but they loved the moose. I thought, well, this is amazing. And so he began to record CDs, and he began going to festivals, and he began making books. And all of a sudden, we were working for the moose. We were working for the moose because of serendipity. Like the way penicillin was discovered, because the guy who was trying to find out this cure in a lab was sloppy and let some mold grow by accident. The mold killed the bacteria. I thought, oh, I see. That is how you're going to kill disease. Anyway, so my advice to you is, it's never too late to be a serendipitist. I still am, following the moose, riding the moose wherever we go. You're never too old to seek your fortune. I don't care how old you are. You're never too old to seek your fortune. And I wish you a lot of luck with your serendipity. Maybe you will find the gold buried under the roots of the tree. Maybe you will catch a glimpse of the golden bird, wander through the forest till you get to the talking fox. Maybe you will find happiness. May you live happily ever after. May we all live happily ever after.
One sunny morning when I was about 10 years old, there was a knock on our front door. My father answered the door, and there was a man in a suit, promising endless possibilities, so much knowledge, wrapped up in a 26-volume set for impossibly small monthly installments. He was a World Book Encyclopedia salesman. My father bought every word of his spiel and a 26-volume set of World Book Encyclopedias. I thought they were wonderful. When the volume was closed, I could run my fingers over the gold-edged pages and never get a paper cut. My dad said that according to his calculations, if we started right away, we could read every word in every volume by the time I graduated from high school. We started with Aardvark, worked our way through the Archbishop of Canterbury, but we got stuck permanently in the art volume. My dad saw a photo of about a half a dozen round ripe peaches in a bright blue ceramic bowl, and he decided we could be artists too. So he bought us oil paints and canvases and, of course, a palette to mix our colors on. You always had to put in white for light, he said. Mix it in good now. And while my grandma Dinah and my mom cleared up for dinner, my sister, my dad, and I went down to his work table, set up everything, and began to mix colors to paint peaches. My mom had bought peaches. It was summertime. And she had borrowed from her friend down the street a big blue bowl. So we were all ready to paint. And of course, our peaches looked like bumpy, fuzzy elbows when they were done. sitting on top of a blue stocking cap. But my dad hung our masterpieces over the sofa in the living room, and there they stayed for many years. He was so proud of us. Now, when I went off to college, I wasn't thinking much about painting, but all the trips to the library all over the years, all the study of that World Book Encyclopedia, and all the painting we did after the Peaches led me to be creative enough that I got very into creative writing. And I even won a free writer's retreat at a beautiful spot on a crystal clear lake in northern Michigan, where I would spend a long weekend with 10 other young writers. Now, among the writers was someone who annoyed me so much. I thought of her as know-it-all hippie Allison. She was tall and beautiful, with long blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes. She was very bright, but she had this habit of passing me in the hallways on campus and lifting up her peace sign and saying, "Peace and love." And she always had the chutzpah, the nerve, to pick a fresh flower when it was the right season on campus and tuck it behind her ear like a true flower child. Of course, Allison was sharing a room with me at the writer's retreat. Now, one morning, the professor who was leading the retreat said to the whole group, "You can go off for a couple hours. It's a beautiful day. And when you come back, write about your experience, no matter what it is." So my friend Dennis and I had noticed a canoe on the lake, and we ran down to the dock, and there it was waiting for us. We got in the canoe and we paddled out to the middle of the lake, and it was a beautiful day with big white puffy clouds. And then we went towards the shore. And when we did, we saw something that looked like an impressionist painting. It was a beautiful sight. On the lush, grassy hill, we saw a whole group of women in long pastel dresses, flowy skirts and flowers around them, and children rolling down the hill. It looked like something that had happened long, long ago. And so we paddled a little closer. And when we did, we saw the women beckoning to us. And one yelled, "Come quickly, welcome, come over here." Well, Dennis and I looked at each other. We were up for an adventure. So we paddled closer and we pulled our canoe up onto the grass. And one of the women said, "It's a miracle. You're just in time. Come, come." And we followed her up the hill. And there, on top of the hill, we saw a small white church. Now, Dennis and I were Jewish. And I didn't know about Dennis from Great Neck, Long Island, but I knew that I had never been inside a church before for a church service. We walked in and we sat on a hard bench surrounded by people. The place was full, and a young pastor stepped out. He was in a suit that was a little too large for him with a striped tie, and he started to speak. He was a good storyteller. He spoke loud and with confidence, and when he would end a sentence, he would hold his hand out like he was catching a softball. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of the service, a woman behind me, jumped up, and she started to speak loudly in a language I had never heard before. But everyone else in the room seemed to understand what she was saying. All of a sudden, she collapsed down onto the bench like she had run out of steam, and someone else stood up and started to speak a complete other language that I didn't understand, and everyone around was nodding their heads. And then she slumped down, and I looked to Dennis, and he made a gesture like, "Let's get out of here." But we were blocked by a very large man who jumped up in the middle of the aisle and started to speak another new language. And we knew it would be rude to leave in the middle, so we sat there through the whole service after one after another congregant stood up and spoke loudly and then fell down onto their seats. When the service was over, the woman behind me, the very first woman who had spoken, said gently, "Are you too hungry?" Now, Dennis and I were always hungry, so we followed everyone down as they chatted pleasantly to the basement. There was one window, and the light was shining through onto a table full of food. Now, there were bologna and cheese sandwiches on Wonder Bread, and there was something orange called an ambrosia salad with marshmallows in it. But sitting in the middle of the table was a white platter covered with round, ripe peaches. I looked at Dennis and I said, "Peaches. They like peaches too." Well, after we ate, we thanked everyone, and we got in the canoe and we paddled back. Now, of course, we had plenty to talk about in our writing assignment. Dennis went fully with plot, but I did like the beginning of his essay. He said, 2 Jews walk into a bar. A service in a church. Know-it-all Allison, when she heard about our experience, said, "Don't you know what that was? It was a Jehovah Witness service, and they don't call it a church. They call it Kingdom Hall. Haven't you ever heard of people speaking in tongues?" Now, I wanted to slap Allison because she was such a know-it-all, but I kind of liked speaking in tongues. My grandma Dinah had always talked about the mama lotion, the mother tongue, Yiddish, the language she spoke as a child in the old country. And my father always told me stories about going to shul, to synagogue, with his grandfather, his Zaidi, and how the men in their long, dark coats would pull on their beards and rock back and forth, and daven, it was called, davening, speaking in the mother lotion as they read the Talmud. So I liked that description. And of course, I had to talk about the peaches in my description of the day, the peaches glowing in the sun from the light coming down through the one window in that basement of Kingdom Hall, the peaches that looked like bright suns. And I remembered what my father said when we were painting the peaches. He said, "What color do you think they are?" And I, thinking I was so clever, said, "Peach." He said, "You're right. The color peach is like no other color at all." Well, when we went back to campus, I would still see Allison walking around with the flower tucked behind her ear. And now when she saw me, she said sarcastically, "Hey, Laura, peaches in love." But I didn't care. Every time she said it, I remembered painting peaches with my father and how there was no other color quite like a peach.
Okay, so what had happened was that I was in Canada in March, about 9 years ago. And I'm of the opinion that Canada should put a closed for the winter sign on that entire country because it is ridiculously cold there. Now, I was touring, doing some storytelling, and I flew into Goose Island in Labrador, Canada, which is really far north in Canada. I think of it as like 20 miles from Santa Claus. I mean, it's not that far north, but it feels that way. And I flew in, and of course, the entire world is frozen. The plane lands, I get out, I'm covered, scarves, hats, coat, gloves, toboggan, the whole thing. You can't see anything. And of course, there are people waiting for me. Donna Washington, I wave at them, they wave back at me. We can't see each other, we're all wrapped up. They're less wrapped up than me, but I think it's just because they live there and they know how to live in that I can't. I get into the car. Oh, it's freezing. I have not been warm in weeks, really, to be fair. But, once I'm in the plane, I can't be as cuddled up as I'd like. They take me to the hotel. I say goodbye to them. They say, we'll see you tomorrow for the show. Do you want us to pick you up tomorrow? And I was like, you know what? I'm exhausted, actually, all the touring I've done. I'm going to take most of that day down. They're like, not a problem. We understand. So I get into the hotel. I do not recall being warm that night, but I must have, because I did get to sleep. And it's a good thing because I had an interview at the local radio station at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, I don't like cold weather, and I'm not a morning person. So at 5, I drag my body out of bed so I can at least start the process of getting ready to go be on a radio somewhere. And I have to walk the half mile because if it's freezing, who wants to get up and drive over to where I'm at, by the airport at 5 o'clock in the morning? They all live further on in the island. So I trudged the half a mile there. It just is miserably cold. The ice, this sort of snow has piled up, and they've been shoveling it and getting it off the roads. It's like above my head on the side, and I'm just get there. And it was a great interview. The guys were alive. They were so much fun on that radio show in the morning. And then, I don't know how much prep they did before I got there. As they were talking to me, one of them was like, can we go to your website? So they say my website, and the guy goes and he starts watching clips, and he's giggling. And in the background, you can hear my voice while I'm talking on the radio, and the guy's giggling, and he's like, you gotta see this. So he pulls up the website for his buddy. Now they're on the radio, watching me on video, talking to me, and I'm thinking, how does this sound out in Radioland when they can't see anything? Anyway, eventually they're like, no, you stop. So I stopped talking. They just played a video, which they were giggling at, which the audience could only hear. And then they turned off and said, oh my gosh, this is going to be so much fun. Anyway, they were great interviewers. They asked great questions. It's over. I'm getting dressed. It's like 6:30. And they're going, you're so easy to interview. And I was like, well, I talk for a living. So if you give me space, I will just talk. And they start laughing. And I'm sure every storyteller, that's happened to every storyteller. So I'm trudging back to the hotel, and I get there, and I have a little breakfast, and now it's like pushing 8 o'clock. And I decide that even though I would like to go look at Goose Island in Labrador, Canada, I do not want to create an international incident by being frozen to death and having to, make someone have to make a phone call. So I stay in the room. And I turn the heat up as high as it can go. And I'm huddled under the blankets. And I've decided to spend the day doing my absolute favorite thing, watching serial killer movies. I love serial killer movies. I yell at those people on the movies. Why are you doing that? Why would you go that way? Don't run down the middle of the road. The whole thing. So I'm doing it. I'm watching one of my favorite ones, which is called Subject Zero. And he's the serial killer who's like got a big refrigerated truck, and he's going across the country. He's committing all these murders. And I'm watching this, and I get a phone call around 10:30, 11 o'clock. And from the front desk, and I answer it. And it's like, someone's here to see you. And I was like, oh my gosh, do I have another appearance? Am I supposed to be somewhere? And look at me, I've got 5 sweatshirts on and 3 pairs of pants and 5 pairs of socks. Oh my gosh. Bad storyteller. But I am dreaded, which means I don't have to worry about my hair. I'm going to run down the hall. I'm going to apologize all over myself, run back to the room, get all the stuff off, put on a nice outfit, throw some makeup on, put my hair up, and we'll be ready to go. 10 minutes tops. So I go tearing down the hall, and there's this guy I've never seen before, but that's okay because I don't really remember what anybody looked like because they were all covered. And before I could say anything, he says to me, would you like to see my art gallery? Sure. So I go back to the room and I get changed and I leave my telephone right there on the nightstand. First serial killer rule, take your phone with you, right? I left it right there. I just forgot about it because I was listening to the movie and sort of chuckling about that's the one that's going to get him caught. And so then I leave my room and forgot my phone. And I go out to the front desk, and I'm shaking hands with this guy. Nope, I must not have seen him last night. And I figure it's a really small island. If he was dangerous, wouldn't the lady at the hotel lady at the front desk, wouldn't she know? Anyway, she just waves us off, and we go out, and he's got a paneled van. I get right inside. And now we're driving around. He goes, would you like to see Goose Island? I'm like, sure. So now he's taking me off the beaten path, down these like windy little roads. We're kind of slipping a little bit because it is frozen. And I'm in little areas like overlooks where there's not another person in the world. And it's beautiful. And my brain is saying, oh yeah, but I mean, people saw him with me, and I am the only black person in this area. Somebody would be like, hey, I saw John with a black lady, and now she's dismembered. There might be a connection. So I thought, okay, I'm pretty good. I'm probably good. It was beautiful. It was a great tour. He told me that when it's warm, I don't believe it's ever warm there, but apparently it's warm enough for stuff to melt, and people come up to kayak and look at the scenery. Anyway, about an hour and a half after our tour, he says to me, oh, by the way, the art gallery is in my house. And I go, great! And so we're now driving to this man's house. And I'm thinking to myself, well, like I said, I'm sitting in the front seat waving at people. There's a big marquee of me downtown by the theater. Somebody will know if I disappear. So we stop at his house. There's a big ice house that he has created in his front yard. It's like a giant igloo. And kids are running in and out. And he goes, oh yeah, I build a big ice house in my front yard every year for the kids of the neighborhood. And they're having the best time. The kids running in and out and in and out. And I'm just like, this is amazing. We go and his art gallery is beautiful. He works with the indigenous populations who are still in this area, and they have handcrafts that they make, and he sells them in his art gallery, and he sells them all over the world. And I actually bought one. It's just cute. And it's a little doll. It has rabbit fur, and it's beautiful. And I loved it. Absolutely love it. And he serves me for lunch bayberry jam, cheese toast, and moose chili. Yeah, picture book food. And I ate this so good. Everything was delicious. People kept stopping in going, oh my gosh, you're the storyteller. We heard you on the radio this morning. And I'm like, oh, does everyone in Goose Island get up at stupid o'clock in the morning and listen to the radio? It's okay. It's all good. It was so much fun. I had so much fun. It was just the best. And then we're driving back to the hotel because it's like 3 o'clock at this point, and I need to start getting ready to do my thing in a couple hours. And we're driving back, and I was like, I'm so glad you picked me up because I was going to stay in the room all day. And he looked at me and said, someone was supposed to call you and tell you I was coming over. I said, nobody did, but I don't mind. I had a great day. He said, so you just randomly went off with a stranger? I was like, well, it's a small island. I figure I was pretty safe. He just starts laughing. And I get back into my room, and I pick up my phone, which of course is still there, and there's 30 messages on it. And I like, oh my gosh, and I look, and they're all from my husband, the David. And I call him back, and he is absolutely freaked out. Where have you been all day? I've been trying to call you all day. You said you were going to be in. Where were you? And so I said, oh, actually, okay, so what happened was, and I told him the whole story. And then at the end of it, I think it's funny. He is not amused. I can't believe you went off with some stranger. He just blew up. And I was very chagrined because, anything could have happened, right? So I promised him I would never go off with a stranger again. And I promised I would try to remember to keep my phone with me. I'm still bad at it, but I try to remember. But the big thing that changed is that I now give people in serial killer movies a little slack because I've been there and I understand what it is to be human and to think nothing's going to happen to me. Well, so far, nothing has.
What happened was, we were all home one Sunday afternoon when my daddy's little brother, my Uncle Frank, drove up in our driveway. Now, my dad was number 8 of 13 children. And Uncle Frank was his next little brother. But right in the middle of all those 13 children, there were 4 boys in a row, and they were always into everything. And Uncle Frank, my daddy always said, was always in charge of bad ideas. So you see, every time he showed up at our house, I knew there was going to be a story, and it was going to be a story about one of his bad ideas that happened to come to life. So it was the afternoon, and Uncle Frank got there, and it wasn't Sunday, it was during the week, but he was all dressed up just like he was going to church. And when he came in our house, my dad said, Frank, all dressed up? My goodness, where in the world are you going? And Uncle Frank says, It's not where I'm going, it's where I've been. He said, I've been to Guy Chambers' funeral. My daddy said, well, I didn't even know Guy died. He said, he sure did. He died last week, and the funeral was this afternoon. Guy Chambers was a neighbor who lived up the road from the farm where my daddy and Uncle Frank had grown up. And now Uncle Frank lived on that farm. So all of a sudden, Uncle Frank started laughing. He started just laughing and laughing and laughing and laughing and laughing. And my dad said, Frank, what in the world is so funny about going to a funeral? And Uncle Frank laughed again. He said, it was so good, it was worth having Guy die just to get to go to that funeral. And I knew a story was on the way. Well, Uncle Frank always liked to get places before anybody else got there. And so he had started off early that afternoon to head up to the church to go to Guy's funeral. The church was at the foot of the hill, and then you went up the hill to the cemetery, and the cemetery was on the top of the hill, and all our relatives were buried up there. And when Uncle Frank drove up there in the parking lot at that old country church, my goodness, there was already a pickup truck there before he got there. And he thought, my, I started out early, but somebody still got here before I did. But he got out of his truck, and all of a sudden, he figured out who it was. It was the gravedigger. You see, the gravedigger had come the day before and opened the grave, and then on the day of the funeral, he'd come back early to check and see that everything was just fine and everything was right to go on with the funeral. And all of a sudden, here came the gravedigger running down the hill from the cemetery, jumping up and down, waving his arms in the air, hollering, stop the funeral, stop the funeral, stop the funeral, stop the funeral. And Uncle Frank said, we can't stop the funeral. Guy went on and died. What's the matter? And then the gravedigger came down and explained everything. He said, you know, yesterday I came and I dug the grave. And when I got back today and went up there in the night, a great big fat skunk fell in the grave. And it's down in there going around and around and around. And you know, we can't have a funeral with a skunk in the grave. And Uncle Frank said he thought for a minute, and he thought, well, the gravedigger didn't know Guy. If he did, he'd know that Guy and a skunk would get along just fine together. But he walked back up the hill with the gravedigger to see if he could see what it was that had really happened. And sure enough, they got up there to the cemetery, and down in the grave, a great big striped skunk was just going round and round and round. It had fallen in the grave, and of course, it couldn't get back out again. My daddy said, Frank, what did you do? Uncle Frank said, well, by then, I'd checked out the gravedigger, and I knew there were some possibilities. So I said to the gravedigger, I believe we can solve this. Just think with me for a minute. And then he looked at the gravedigger and he said, now let's think about this. What if that skunk, instead of being in the grave, were right up here on the ground beside us, and it decided it wanted to spray us? What's the last thing it would have to do before it could spray us? Well, the gravedigger thought about it for a minute, and then he said, lift up its tail. And Uncle Frank says, that is correct. Now we're on the right track. Keep thinking with me. A skunk has enough muscles in its tail to lift up its tail, and that's how it squirts somebody. But if you should pick a skunk up by the tail, it doesn't have enough muscles in its tail to lift its whole body, and you have it locked shut. He said the gravedigger just stood there and scratched his head while he was thinking about that. And then Uncle Frank said to the man, he said, you know, I would do this first part, but I hurt my leg and I can't jump down in there. But if you'll jump down in the grave and grab that skunk by the tail and pick it up and lock it shut, and then hand it up here to me, I'll get it by the tail and I'll carry it over there and I'll throw it across the fence into the woods, and we could go right on with the funeral. My daddy said, Frank, what happened after that? Uncle Frank laughed again and he said, Joe, you don't smell anything, do you? We did it. That man jumped down in the grave. He grabbed that skunk by the tail and held it up. The skunk was just kicking and squealing and kicking and squealing, but it couldn't squirt. And he held it up in the air, and I thought, if it didn't squirt him, it can't squirt me. So I got it by the tail, and I carried it over to the side, and I tossed it across the fence, and it ran off in the woods, and Guy is now in the ground skunk-free. He said, then I just had to get a little ladder and help that gravedigger get up out of the grave so the day could go on. Well, we laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. And after Uncle Frank left, my daddy gathered me and my brother Joe up, and he said, now, boys, every time your Uncle Frank tells you something, you need to learn something. So what did you learn from what you heard today? My little brother laughed and he said, well, what I learned was you never know what's going to happen, so you might as well just go ahead and try stuff. My daddy shook his head. He said, oh. And then he looked at me and he said, I hope you learned something better than that. I said, I did. I learned that if you never know what's going to happen, you always get somebody else to try it first. And then my daddy laughed. He said, boys, when you grow up, if you have children, your Uncle Frank will be the best teacher they'll ever have. Because you need to get your children to ask him questions, hear what he says, ask him questions, watch what he does, and then teach them they better not do any of it. And we laughed again. Now, we have a grandson who is 9 years old, and guess what his name is? His name is Frank. He got that name because in his daddy Kelly's memory, his Uncle Frank was Kelly's favorite childhood relative. But you know what the strange thing is? Uncle Frank died about 5 years before Kelly was born. But Kelly has heard so many, many stories about his Uncle Frank that you can't convince him that he doesn't actually remember Uncle Frank himself. And you see, that shows us how important telling stories in the family is. Because if we tell stories and tell stories and tell stories and tell stories, then our children and our grandchildren have a chance to get to know people who were long gone before they were born and know them so well that they believe they truly remember them. And that is what happened.
Thank you for tuning in for the virtual kickoff to this year's Midland Storytelling Festival. The best part is that you can enjoy these stories to your heart's content as often as you like in replay. Be sure to join us for the remainder of the festival. Go to our Facebook page or our website at midlandstorytellingfestival.org to see the full festival schedule. Then keep it locked right here and like, comment, share, and subscribe. Tell everybody. And thank you for watching. We'll see you at the festival.